Don't look at the camera.
Yeah, just like you're talking to me.
Yeah.
Talking to Brad.
What does it say? Is my hair fixed? And my shirt buttoned? Before you roll this thing, what kind of question you going to ask me for what we get into? You're just going to shoot something and let it go?
We're just going to talk.
Okay. If you go back a little bit far enough, when it did the Centennial, which was November 1964, there was very little talk about battlefield preservation. I mean, it seemed like the monument on the square was important. And then Winstead Hill was donated in 1946. Carter House saved in 1951. And so it seemed like that's all the town wanted. So to put on the Centennial, people in Franklin got interested in it, but not enough to reclaim any of the land. It was just like, it's going to happen one time and that's it. Some of us, reenactors, eventually went other places, and people would ask us, why aren't they doing anything in Franklin? Well, mostly because they didn't want anything else other than these 3 sites. Carton was in bad shape. To tell you the truth, it was way back off the road back in those days. The cemetery, you could ride out there on a bicycle at the cemetery, but you didn't want to go at the ghost house. You may want to cut that out.
I think when you see at 4 o'clock these Confederates now approaching, the attack is commenced, you feel a rush of fear and concern, but really in that situation, you have the advantages. You've got a static position, and all you have to do is hold it. They've got to cover ground. We can shoot them before they get here, keep them from getting into the works, make them pay for every step they're going to take, because they've got to come to you. You've got the advantages. Fight on your terms. Don't stop firing. And if they come, you fight. You fight viciously. You don't give them a single inch.
As the afternoon deepens and things move closer to 4 o'clock, things stood on the edge of insanity. There was a man named Walter Rohrer who served in the 20th Mississippi Infantry, and Rohrer was born in Virginia but had lived in Mississippi for many years. He was an educated man. He had been through it all. Rohrer wrote a letter home just a few weeks before the battle, and he talked about things that soldiers do, you know, the conditions of the army, food, weather, where they were going, what he hoped. He believed they could win. He believed that with one final push, independence could yet be secured. But Rohrer also went on to explain that he and many of his comrades were noble martyrs engaged in a holy cause. He said that there was no cause more holy than the cause of the Confederacy. And when you're dealing with someone who believes they're fighting a holy war, and someone who believes they're a martyr, which means they're willing to be sacrificed, you can see why the U.S. soldiers gauged, I think very correctly, how very dangerous the Southern Army was. And that's one of the tragedies of the campaign and of the battle, is people really, in later years, would marginalize Franklin. That it wasn't important, it didn't really matter. Oh, it did. It did to those who participated, and they knew the stakes. They knew the war might end as a result of this campaign, and they also knew full well this war could drag on for months and months.
There was a soldier here whose name was Josephus Bond. He survived the war, and his obituary also tells the story of him being about 60 years old. He told his wife that he was going to go take his shotgun and kill himself. His obituary says that his wife paid him no credence, which I always wonder if that means maybe he said this all the time. And maybe it wasn't any different until she heard the sound of the shotgun blast. And she went into their backyard and found him in a ditch. Edward Moth in the 72nd Illinois ends up being in and out of lunatic asylums for the rest of his life. They said he would compulsively build fences in his yard and tear them down and rebuild them. He would be a kind and loving person, then he'd be mentally and physically abusive to his wife and kids. And while we can never get in his head, it's easy to think he's reliving moments where a defense is so crucial, and he's living with that memory for years.
Hood's effort to retake Nashville wasn't just an effort to take a city, it was to drag the war out, extend it into the spring and summer of 1865 and bleed the North out, and get them to finally perhaps give up. We can look back on it today and say, well, it was all going to be over by the spring of 65. Nobody knew that in the fall of 1864. No one. Neither side. This is what it had come to. The American experiment, this opportunity for people to govern themselves, had degenerated into mob rule, chaos, and destruction. in a landscape on fire, and 40,000 soldiers in a town of about 750 stood poised to witness something that those who survived it wouldn't really be able to accurately describe.
When this campaign begins, just a few weeks prior, Abraham Lincoln had won re-election. This can easily be understated, but it shouldn't, because Lincoln's promise in this election was that if he won, he would see the war through to its conclusion. He would not grant the Confederacy their independence. Lincoln wins re-election, but he also receives about 75% of the vote from US soldiers. The Confederate soldiers wouldn't know that the war would end in just a few months, but the idea that your enemy just said, "We are locked in," tells the average Confederate soldier that this is a desperate time. This is a time of win or die trying.
I think you get deep enough into this and you've paid enough cost that you can't give up at that point. To turn back means you were wrong about everything. And if you were wrong about everything, you've just paid a tremendous price for your mistake. And so I think that's why people ride mistakes to their bitter end.
Much of the month of November, there's a lot of maneuvering between the opposing forces, but ultimately in the last week of November, things begin to move in a rather frantic pace. And Hood knows his window of opportunity is very narrow, so what he's trying to do is outflank Schofield. He's trying to get behind him. Schofield is trying to slow Hood down. Reinforcements are being moved slowly toward Nashville. So this is a game of time, really. Hood comes again very close to cutting Schofield off from Nashville at a little place called Spring Hill. On November 29th, really one of the greatest escapes of the entire war plays out as the U.S. Army slips away under cover of darkness.
Over 20,000 US soldiers march right past the Confederate forces in the middle of the night using the Columbia Turnpike. They march all night long. They arrive in Franklin the next morning, only to find that their path out of Franklin onto Nashville is blocked. The Harpeth River has flooded, and the bridges need to be repaired. Starting at about sunrise on November 30th, the U.S. forces begin to set up a series of defensive lines covering the field south of town. You also get the sense when they got there that day and began setting up battle lines that this was kind of just a precaution. Even into the interactions that General Cox had with the Carter family, it seems like they weren't really expecting there to be a battle here, at least not at the magnitude that is about to take place. Early afternoon, they look to the fields south of town, and there's the Army of Tennessee assembling piece by piece into an attack formation. Even then, they're hoping that this is all just a facade. But then at 4 p.m., the Confederates begin to march.
There's something existent that afternoon that's almost hard to put your finger on. The sentiment of the Southern soldiers who remained in the ranks of this army were committed on a level that, from the perspective of 150 plus years, is really hard to almost get your arms wrapped around. For them, their way of life, everything they knew, was disintegrating, dissolving in front of their eyes, and really had been for some time. They now knew that this war for Southern independence was a war being waged to destroy slavery. Many had died, many had deserted, many had simply mustered out and gone home. These were the men who remained behind. And when they said they were willing to die, they meant it. They did not want to be conquered. They did not want to be subjugated. They did not want to relent, and they did not want to give up. Their level of dedication was ferocious, and the best testament to those men and their levels of commitment were written often by the men on the other side. In Schofield's army knew full well how dangerous the Southern Army was. They had come at them again and again and again and again, and they would see it one more time at Franklin.
It's hard to imagine anyone who understands the cost of war more than Fountain Branch Carter. The day of the battle here in Franklin, first of all, he sees his farm ripped apart. This is a farm he spent 35 years building. And the fences are being ripped apart and the orchard is cut down, and this place that he has created as a place of safety and provision for his family is now being destroyed. And he has 15 family members living in his house, and he has to even figure out a way to protect them that day and make sure they stay safe. There's going to be another cost. During the battle, his son Todd, who is out in the fighting, is seriously injured. And so when the fighting stops, he has to go out into the night to look for him.
There's a version of the Todd Carter story that is, a young man gets swept up in the fervor of secession. He joins the Confederate Army. He's ultimately captured, serves time as a prisoner of war, but he escapes. What does he do when he escapes? He doesn't go home. He goes back to the war. He's able to join the Army of Tennessee for their invasion into Tennessee, for their triumphant return home. Here at the Battle of Franklin, he leads troops in a glorious assault that ends just a couple hundred yards away from his home. home he hasn't seen in over 3 years. Mortally wounded, but he's carried home and he dies in the family parlor surrounded by loved ones. That's a version of the Todd Carter story. There's also another version, and that story is a young man who grew up in a South where slavery was entrenched. It was a way of life. It was God ordained. He was a young man who was mortally wounded in combat and was fortunate enough to be carried to his home. He died in his home, surrounded by his family. They were able to bury him properly. They were able to know where he was buried. They knew what happened to him. That doesn't mitigate the loss of his death in any way, shape, or form, but it does allow some consolation, some peace that other families don't get. There were tens of thousands of young men in this country who marched off one day, probably with a band playing, probably a very triumphant scene, and they just never came home. That's something to remember too when we think about Todd Carter dying.
Just after 4 o'clock, as the Confederate attack is rolling forward, it's 20,000 troops, 6 Confederate divisions, 18 brigades, attacking a similar number of U.S. troops. But there is this unbelievable spectacle that begins to play out as the Southern Army, or portions of it, actually break the center of the U.S. defensive position. And what's so easily forgotten in the ultimate Confederate carnage is how close Hood's army came to achieving what Hood intended, which was to break Schofield's army up against the Harpeth River and hopefully destroy it. Elements of 2 Confederate divisions, Cleburne and John Brown's, gashed the center, ripped a hole 150, 200 yards wide, and into this breach pour probably a couple of thousand Southern troops, men from Tennessee, Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. There's a moment when they almost did it. There were 3 separate things that happened on the U.S. side, and they're different events, but they're all tied together almost by instinct, by training, and by discipline. And the U.S. Army launches a counterassault, makes a stand, seals the breach, and then the bloodletting just intensifies. And in some ways, it was the beginning of something completely different. That's why Franklin's important. The Old South didn't die here, but something new began to emerge. And that was a country that had been redefined by war.
Following the American Civil War, we are extricated. The institution of slavery does not exist anymore. And it creates immense possibilities for all of us, because now we can finally live in a world where equality is a possibility, and we are going to have to grow into it. All of us are going to have to grow into it. It doesn't happen overnight, but the process has begun. This is a new birth of freedom, a chance to get it right this time. It's a good starting place for moving forward, and we will all be better because of this new world that's been created. And this system that people like the McGavicks and the Carters were born into, that they hardly even knew to question, doesn't exist anymore.
That's a real gift of a battlefield, of visiting a battlefield. You can read about these things, you can see where they happened, and it's really the closest thing you get to time travel. One of the things visitors often do when they walk up is they look at that porch and they kind of get this smile. You can see that they always want to take a picture of it. And it's one of those romantic notions of what the South must have been like. Because there are people who lived here at Carnton who didn't have a very nice existence, who could be bought, sold, punished, given away at their master's whim.
The Battle of Franklin is arguably as bad as armed conflict could be. This just ends because there's not much more killing to be done. The battle just begins to slowly, inexorably dissipate. 7:30, 8 o'clock. There are these spasms of fighting that go on for the next hour, hour and a half. But slowly, the survivors, they just stop pulling the trigger. You know, there's this weird thing that happens when you've been through something where the sounds are so violent and concussive that the silence is almost startling. Except the combat ended, and then the silence was replaced with the wailing and the crying and the screaming of the wounded and the dying, the humans and the animals all mixed together. There was a man here named Isaac Sherwood who became a pacifist that night. He was so warped and shaped by Franklin. Emerson Updike, his curiosity sets in, and Updike went to look at the dead. He said he'd never seen them lay so thickly as they did in the powder-dim starlight. We've sanitized the war. We've sanitized the whole thing. We forgot what we really did. And what we really did was nearly destroyed ourselves.